My name is David Malone. I have the privilege of working here in IDRC. Our guest today is Pankaj Mishra, a return guest to IDRC. We're doubly happy to have you. And we're going to be discussing this book, From the Ruins of Empire. It's available outside, by the way, for those who are with us today in person. It's a terrific read. I finished it 3 days ago. I learned a tremendous amount. It is largely set at the beginning of the last century and deals with the rather, in some ways, different effects of empire on the Ottoman Empire and some of the dependencies of the Ottoman Empire, the British India, and China, and many secondary actors come in. There are three primary protagonists, I'd say, in the book. Pankaj, would you tell us a bit about them? But perhaps first tell us a bit about where the book came from, what inspired you to write it.
Thank you, David, for having me here again. The book came out originally from a very simple idea, which was that the whole experience of Western imperialism in large parts of Asia, which was available, which had been written about in particular nationalist histories, and of course had been written about in a very different way in the histories of empire that were authored in the old imperial metropolises, London primarily. But there were large gaps in these particular histories, and they certainly did not include figures like the ones I describe in the book, Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Liang Qichao. Liang Qichao, of course, features in the histories of China, but he's not to be found in other histories where he also played
Indeed, I hadn't heard of him, to my shame.
Likewise. So for me also this book was very much a process. It came out of a process of discovery and learning, reading randomly across several disciplines, not knowing really what I was looking for, but being sent on a kind of hunt from book to book. I used to read bibliographies very carefully and then look for those books wherever I could find them. And then at some point, I think a particular narrative began to emerge in my mind, which was not so much about how Western imperialism was experienced by a lot of people in Asia, but also about how people, some of the most intelligent, sensitive, articulate people in Asia, late 19th century, 20th century, responded to it. How did they formulate their particular responses to the challenge Western power posed to themselves, to their societies, to their sense of who they were, to their own sense of their traditions, their civilizations. So it broadened. It became a bigger, more ambitious book. And I started to look for characters, people who I could write about, and put them in a narrative, really, because I'm not a trained historian, I'm not a trained academic scholar, but what I'm interested in are narratives, are stories that cover a particular time frame and tell you about the particular individuals, their experiences, their states of mind. What was it like for someone to be a young person in Turkey or young Iranian intellectual in the 1880s or 1890s? Those are the kind of questions that were important for me. What were they thinking at that point? And a figure like Jamaluddin al-Afghani was immensely important because although born in Iran, he traveled all across the Muslim world, South Asia, the Middle East. He didn't go to Southeast Asia, but that was almost the only major part he missed of the Muslim world. And he was incredibly influential in Egypt and in Iran, where he led the first major political movement in 1891, an extremely successful one too, which in many ways is sort of was almost a predecessor for the Islamic Revolution back in 1979. In Egypt, he was closely allied to some of the most important figures in Egypt, both religious scholars, nationalist figures like Saad Zaghloul, who's considered the father of the Egyptian nation. And then he was an advisor to the Ottoman Sultan, Abdulhamid. And while traveling through these different territories, different national political contexts, he was able to see how these societies had been conquered, how these societies had been subjugated. And it all begins with India, post-mutiny, post-1857, when he sees the destruction of a whole culture in North India by extremely vengeful British authority in that region. And he absorbs these particular lessons and the way in which India had been subjugated, and he takes them, he travels with them, he tells Egyptians about them, he warns the Iranians about them, about what could be their fate. And the same with Liang in the way he saw the weakness of imperial China before the organized nation states of Europe, and how a great civilization like China, and someone like him who had been brought up in the old system, very much thought of China as the center of the world, of their sort of political system to be superior to everyone else, to everything else in the world. So for them it was with a great sense of shock and humiliation that they registered the fallen condition of China in the international order in the late 19th century. And that's when he started looking, that's when he started reading, that's when he started looking at other societies and comparing their plight with China's plight. And a whole branch of comparative politics developed back in late 1890s and the early 20th century. And of course, Liang went to Japan, where he met exiles from other Asian countries who had come to Japan to learn the secrets of Japanese power. And Liang also went to America, where he saw American politics, American business from very close, and again described it really brilliantly, and also wondered about the applicability of that model, of that political economic model for China. Again, in the sort of range of speculations, you see extremely brilliant insights into the American political system, the close, this kind of synergy that exists between business and politics, the way politicians are exalted to power, that particular journey, and the way democracy works, the way the minorities are treated, and the way American business, having completed kind of internal expansion, was now looking for markets abroad. So this is the beginning of the whole expansion, worldwide expansion of American political and commercial interests. And he's at that moment, he's seeing this very clearly. And he's also looking at great inequalities within America that exists. In many ways, a much more perceptive observer of the American scene than Henry James, who comes just 4 years later for what turns out to be his book about America, The American Scene. And obviously, Henry James is not interested in the kind of questions that Liang is interested in, but still extraordinarily perceptive. And then he gets involved in Chinese internal politics and goes to 1919, which is a very important moment, the Paris Peace Conference, which we think of, have thought of in the past as important for the fate of Europe and for setting up another world war in Europe. But if you look at it from the Asian perspective, 1919 is the moment where Asian nationalist movements get going. Again, born from a moment of extreme humiliation, which almost all major Asian powers suffer at that particular conference at the hands of Europe and America. And then, of course, Tagore, who's the third of these figures I write about. At less, I deal with him not in such great detail as Al-Afghani, but Tagore is very useful in the particular framework that I chose for this book, in being extremely critical of certain political tendencies that were emerging in Asia at that time as a response to Western imperialism, as a response to Western power. And he sees that, first of all, in Japan, which has embraced the idea of the Western imperial nation state and believes that that is what they have to become themselves in order to match the power of the West. And Tagore is, from the very beginning, a great critic of this whole process whereby Asian countries turn into inferior clones of European powers. So he is very important in the book as offering a kind of commentary on this whole process whereby Asian ideas are adopted by Asians in order to resist the power of the West. But at the same time, as they turn out to be, in Japan's case, extremely dangerous and ideas that cause great devastation across Asia.
Tagore, of course, is the one of your three protagonists who I think is most familiar to most of us in the West. He won a Nobel Prize very early on. He was a sort of polymath who was a great writer, also quite an accomplished painter, a very major figure in India's history. Your book gets off to a terrific start. It really grabs you because you compress into a very few pages what empire had wrought in Asia, and also how several European powers were beginning to feast on the decaying Ottoman Empire and what the consequences of that were to be. And you also introduced, to be a bit more specific about Japan, how Japan became the first Asian power to defeat a European power, which triggered a whole new line of thinking in Asia. And I wondered if you'd expand on that for a second or two.
The book begins with this major battle, which is called the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, between the Russian and Japanese Navy. And the Japanese win, and it brings to this war between Russia and Japan to an end. This news of this victory really spreads like wildfire across Asia, delighting a range of Asian thinkers and intellectuals from, someone like Tagore, who's we can't think of a more, a bigger example of a pacifist person, but even he is delighted by this news of a military victory, and he gets his students to follow him around this school courtyard in a kind of impromptu victory parade. And Gandhi is a lawyer in South Africa at that time, and he immediately sees the importance of this. And he says that we still don't know what the consequences of this victory will be, but this is going to be a defining moment in the history of Asia. The same sentiments are shared by Ataturk, who's a soldier in Damascus. Sun Yat-sen is in London at that time, and he also, although he's a Chinese nationalist, and China has already felt the sharp edge of Japanese power by being defeated by it in 1895. But even he is delighted, and he's on his way back to China, and the ship stops for refueling in the Middle East, and Arab boat workers come up to him and think he's Japanese and start congratulating him on his victory. This is big news in Cairo, and the great Egyptian nationalist at the time, Mustafa Kamil, has already written a book about how Japan is setting the sort of paving the path for other Asian countries to modernize themselves. So just coming across instances of these celebrations in various histories, also in individual memoirs. I forgot Jevonlalnehru, who's a public school boy at that time, who's been following this battle as a little boy in his provincial city of Allahabad, and then he goes to Harrow in England, and he's on his public school, he's on this train to his school when he hears of this victory, and he's immediately delighted by it. He writes about it as an autobiography. There are several other autobiographies where I kept coming across mentions of this particular battle, and I began to realize that this was a really important moment, and in many ways the history of modern Asia really begins in 1905, and then it sets off a series of revolutions. The Persians are the first ones to insist upon a constitution. That's the other lesson they draw from it. The reason why Japan won is because it was able to modernize itself, get rid of arbitrary power, despotism, have a proper constitution, have a parliament of sorts, galvanize, mobilize its citizens, create some kind of a national strength through mobilizing the most productive members of its population. And all of that can be done if you have these particular institutions in place, like an elected parliament, like a constitution, and you check the power of the sort of monarch or the despot. So everyone across Asia absorbs these lessons. The Ottomans do, the Persians do, and then they go on to introduce these reforms within their own societies. So what Gandhi said about this moment being really a very significant one is then attested by what happens in Asia from that moment. And of course, people from all across Asia travel to Japan to learn, to educate themselves in these new mysteries of power. And again, the range of people from the first generation of Vietnamese nationalists to the Buddhist monk, who also turns out to be a major figure in the history of Burma, he travels to Tokyo. Any number of Muslim students from Egypt and Indonesia, what was then Java, traveled to Tokyo. And of course, there are people from Calcutta who already, there, and already, and more people arrive after this particular Battle of Tsushima. So it's a really important moment. And for me, again, looking for a narrative, it seemed like the right moment to start the book and to show the kind of shared feelings of humiliation that almost all Asians at that time harbored within themselves, and how that victory allowed them a kind of emotional release at that moment. It's always also a darkly ambiguous victory, because we know that Japan is now going to turn out to be an imperialist power and cause great suffering. Often in the countries a lot of the people who are excited by Japan's victory belong to.
Indeed. Pankaj, shifting gears somewhat, but coming to what is really an underlying theme of the book as it pertains to empire. When I was a kid, to the extent that I thought about empire, indeed, when I was a young adult, to the extent I thought about empire, I probably would have defined it as primarily a geostrategic phenomenon in which countries simply wanted to extend their reach, their domination over others as a matter of the display of power. But of course, what comes through so strongly in your book is that empire was really an economic project in every instance, that it was a project of exploitation. It took different forms in different places, but there was always the central purpose to it. And I think the consequences of that linger in Asia to this day, in the thinking of those in government, in the thinking of those in education, and in virtually every walk of life. And I wondered if you'd say a word or two about that.
I think there's been a lot of romantic literature around the idea of empire, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, a lot of romantic histories of empire. And, of course, the progenitor of these accounts of empire is the poet Kipling, who creates these really very influential myths about the empire as being essentially this benign, civilizing force which the people who staff empires, and there's a whole mythology of administrators and engineers that he creates with his extremely captivating fiction and poetry. People selflessly engaged in the task of civilizing the natives, lifting them up from dark superstition to the light of Western civilization. And that has proved extremely influential to the point where the inner workings of empire have been obscured, and the fact that it was largely a money-making concern for everyone, really concerned. I mean, there were some other motives at work, and sometimes there were, parts of Africa where nobody knew what the empire was doing there. People were there simply because they found this so-called virgin territory and thought, let's make it ours. So the French got there, the British got there, and quite a few places in Asia and Africa which were not conquered originally or then maintained as imperial possessions with an economic motive in mind. They were just there because they just found this place, and then it just was too inconvenient to lose them. But in large parts of Asia, it was an economic concern. It was a money-making concern. And institutions were created in order to expedite the money-making. So when we talk about bringing railways to India, when we talk about creating institutions like universities or colleges in India in the 19th century, we're not talking about these as part of a civilizing process. This was very much done in order to expedite the economic exploitation of India. That was their original purpose. And to answer your question in a slightly long-winded way, what happened in the post-colonial era is that not only did we inherit those institutions that were primarily designed, whether it's the railways or the police force, which in the colonial era was primarily a tool to keep the natives under control. So if today the police in India still have a very menacing presence in the lives of most people, it's because they acquired these powers during those colonial era. And even in democratic India, those powers had not been reduced or shrunk. And you could generalize also about various other institutions that we inherited. All of them were institutions really designed to, again, maintain imperial structures in place. And also the ways in which imperialism created ideas about political institutions, what kind of economy should we have. So in 1947, after being systematically deindustrialized, we were then faced with the prospect of rapidly industrializing ourselves in order to catch up with the West that was already a century ahead of us. So we end up with major disasters in large parts of Asia. The one that comes immediately to mind is the Great Leap Forward in China, where Mao Zedong commits China to catching up with Britain in 7 years, 15 years. The numbers kept changing according to how mad he was at any point in time. But the intention was to catch up in a very short time frame, because otherwise the fear was that China will not survive. There were far too many external pressures on them. We went through in India this period where we thought we could create an industrial society without relying upon the sort of Western modes of free trade, because we were at a complete disadvantage there, having been reduced to a supplier of raw materials to industrial powers. So we experimented, and in the last 20 years we've gone back to embracing these sort of older ideas of free market capitalism, free trade, consumer-oriented economies. So in that sense, the legacy of imperialism has been really extremely strong and overwhelming, and it has managed to survive decolonization and the whole sort of history of post-colonial countries, which is now 50, 60 years old in most parts of Asia, if not Africa. We see again that legacy reviving itself in all kinds of unexpected ways.
Well, one aspect of the book you don't spend a great deal of time on, but you're extremely vivid on, is the sort of international reach of empire. By the late 19th century, the Brits were really enjoying their tea and were buying rather a lot of it from China. But Britain was, as a result, running a huge trade deficit with China and had to dream up some way of countering that. And the way it came up with to counter it was to start conducting a very aggressive opium trade out of India into China with, as we know, devastating consequences for China. So the reach of empire, not just within countries and affecting individual societies, but also across major countries of Asia, was very striking in those pages.
Absolutely, and we have to remember it was completely unprecedented. There had been empires in the past. In fact, human history is impossible to conceive of without thinking of large empires, whether it's Chandragupta Maurya in India, whether it's the Romans. But none of these empires, until the modern era, the Ottomans, the Habsburg, the Qing, had the kind of institutional capacity, the military firepower, and the global reach that modern European imperialisms had. And it was because, of course, of industrial capitalism, that process that gotten underway, and innovations, steamships, small things could add up to decisive advantages over older societies like China's. The fact that you could recruit for coolie labor in China, in southern China, and in India, set them all the way across the world to work in the Caribbean plantations. This was unprecedented. This had never happened before. You did have, sort of labor mobility, slave labor within confined areas, but this kind of global hierarchy had never really existed before. And the way also it systematically degraded certain parts of the world, like India, for instance, into turning, pretty sophisticated commercial economy into essentially this supplier of raw materials, and which meant also forcing people who had been in subsistence economies for a long time, forcing them to produce the kind of crop they wanted for their particular trading relationship with, you gave the example of China, there were others. So in that sense, the disruption there was in a completely unprecedented scale.
Now, I'm going to invite those of you who would like to intervene to go to one or other of the microphones. It'd be great to hear what's on your mind, what you'd like to know more about. But before we get there, I wanted to ask Pankaj about his very equivocal conclusion to the book. When you're in the middle of the book, you wonder where this is leading. Is it going to lead to an articulation of, well, now it's Asia's turn, now Asia will emerge triumphant from this, centuries-long ordeal? But that's not actually where you wind up. So would you tell us a bit about that? And do please think of the microphone.
I think it was absolutely impossible to arrive at that conclusion, having once started to trace these particular trajectories, intellectual trajectories, political trajectories of societies essentially forced more and more to adopt Western models of the nation state, particular forms of economic growth, which meant essentially, and Japan was the first country to show how it could be done, again, a very dark example of how you become an imperial nation state. If you want to modernize, small population, not enough resources on hand, you need to look for territories and resources elsewhere, which they started doing, soon ended up in conflicts with its neighbors, ended up finally in conflicts with other European empires who were already in Asia. That's also the story of 20th century Europe, a country that was left out of the worldwide 19th century European scramble for territories and resources. Germany decided this was finally their moment to recreate an empire within Europe itself. This was their brainwave, and the rest of this horrible story is much better known. But the motivations that went into creating these particular forms of imperial nation states, which is what large countries in Asia have now adopted. Models built upon endless growth, upon endless expansion, consumer-oriented economies, massive urbanization, moving hundreds of millions of people who have lived in rural areas, subsisting sometimes, but having a fair deal of food security over a very long period, moving them into urban areas, even though urban areas are not really equipped to deal with such massive transfers of population, especially in a place like India. The Chinese are better organized there. So you're looking at not only huge problems of social unrest, internal turmoil within these large countries who are now committed themselves to a Western model of development and economic growth, but you're also looking at the potential for conflict between these countries as they rise, along with the hundreds of millions of aspiring middle-class people wanting, more cars, more space, better gadgets. You just can't imagine that our planet, which is also already suffering environmentally the consequences of meeting the desires of a few hundred million Europeans and Americans, how it would accommodate the aspirations for similar lifestyles of billions of Indians and Chinese. How this is possible. And this is where any kind of triumphalism is just completely inappropriate when we talk about rising Asia, because we are looking at a really a situation which is deeply, deeply fraught with potential for great conflict and violence.
Now over to the audience. Who is going to come forward? Please, go ahead. Why don't the two of you go and intervene, and we'll sort that out. Please, sir, go ahead, and might you introduce yourself, please?
Excuse me. My name is Richard Harmston. I'm with the Group of 78 and South Asia Partnership. I'd like to pick up on this last note, because the question that was emerging in my mind was half anticipated by David, and that is, do you think the era, the long historical era of empire is therefore over? Have we reached a point where empires, as you've described them and noted them, have had their day, and we're going to some sort of other international configuration, or not? And what prompted this at the beginning was just the emergence of China's power, the potential emergence of India's power, economically led, yes, but has the military strength building behind it in both cases, respectively. And within all of that, I'm wondering if you see the emergence of what are seen as universal values that have come out of the disintegration of empire and the experiment of extreme authoritarian nationalism in the 20th century. The values such as human rights and democratic process, equality of men and women, these sorts of things, are they here for real and for good, or are they going to fade with the emergence of some sort of other international configuration of a new form of empire?
Thank you. And perhaps would you mind waiting, because that's quite a lot to respond to. So if you don't mind holding on, Pankaj, go ahead.
I wish I could say the answer to your question was yes, that the age of empire was over. But I think we see the essential paradigm of empire, which was that nation-states who achieve a certain degree of economic growth then start looking, in order to expand, for territories and resources elsewhere, markets, investments. So all the surplus capital that's being generated in these new nation states of Europe, it needs a destination. The kind of industrial processes that have been set into motion there, they need certain raw materials. The idea of empire is so intimately linked with those processes. And that, of course, originally fuels modern imperialisms as we've seen them. But the age of empire is not over, in the sense that if we import those processes of industrial capitalism into countries like India and China, then we are still looking at political models, the nation state primarily, which is still relying upon expansion, endless growth, new markets, new resources, new territories. And since all of us are doing it within this sort of a kind of worldwide framework of the nation state, then there's bound to be conflict. And there's also, not to mention, Africa is up for grabs again. But there's a new scramble for resources in Africa underway at this point, where India and China are the two countries recreating, in some ways, the older, slightly very unfortunate history of Africa in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So if you start looking at it that way, then the age of empire is not over, because those imperial paradigms have survived. They've been adopted by other nation states, both in so-called authoritarian states like China, and indeed in democratic states. I mean, it barely matters what kind of political system you have once you've adopted those political. It barely matters whether you're communist or capitalist. I mean, look at the damage caused by communism in its search for that holy grail of economic development. It was all for that. It wasn't for any other way of existence. It wasn't about making rural life viable. It was about urbanization. It was about industrialization. So that was also another kind of imperial model, and we know the violence that caused in the Soviet Union and China.
Sir, please.
Hi. My name is Amitav Rath, and I don't have really big issues to ask you, but a couple of comments to make. I mean, the kind of question that bothered you has been in my thinking for some time, but with less productive outcomes than your book, which I haven't read as yet, but I will. But both having read reviews and some of your other work, I think, there are a number of positive things. You need not be so despondent. I think your eyes and the kind of questions you're asking and the book you have written is adding to our understanding of world history. And having grown up early in the period of independence, I remember the school books which still celebrated the Queen's birthday and described India in ways that would be totally acceptable in English textbooks. It was always about 20, 30 years behind what was happening on the ground. I just wondered, you touched on China. I loved Amitav Ghosh's several books, which to me is one of the first persons who sort of asked questions. Just to contrapose it, you mentioned 1919, and one of our neighbors here in Ottawa wrote an extremely famous book on 1919. And when you read it, if you read it from a third world perspective, they were always being neglected. And in the narrative, they get 3 sentences and we move back to what happened in Europe. So, but if you read Amitabh Ghosh, that is the perspective, and you see that other things were going on. And for instance, on the battles in Southeast Asia, and where did the Indians play their role, and Subhash Bose. Even Subhash Bose, I don't think we have quite taken him into account in India. I mean, and he happened to be from my school. Anyway, so to cut a long comment short, I think that is positive. I think we'll get many more voices like that. That is positive. And I just want to know, after your writing of the book, are you getting a lot of similar views from Indians at least and other third world people? I know you won't get it from Niall Ferguson, and you didn't touch on that.
There have been, I think, quite sympathetic responses generally to this line of thinking. Because I think there is definitely a widely shared sense that we are in a crisis right now, that the older distinctions of left versus right, capitalism versus socialism, they have lost their persuasive power, and that we need to have maybe a broader perspective on what really happened in the last 150, 200 years, which doesn't depend upon these binaries, which doesn't depend upon these so-called clash of ideologies that we've been told have been fueling history. Because you can fool yourself into thinking the Second World War was all about liberal democracy versus fascism. We know it wasn't about that. It was a much more intimate battle between different European imperialisms, something that someone like Nehru could see back in the 1930s. Someone like Hannah Arendt writes about it in the 1950s. So I think now there is definitely a sense, and also because post-colonial countries, they're now 50, 60 years old, most of them. And we've seen the kind of calamities that they have suffered in the course of trying to make themselves powerful and important and strong. So there is that sense which I think adds to this desire to, look again into these older histories, which certainly has prompted me into writing this book, and I'm sure also prompts in a different way writers like Amitabh Ghosh or a thinker like Amartya Sen, who's also explored certain neglected parts of India's intellectual tradition, is history. Because what we've been told in our history classes, what we've been told by our policymakers, by what our newspapers, by intelligentsia in the last 50, 60 years, it doesn't quite resonate. It doesn't quite convince in the way it used to. And I think this book is part very much of a larger project which other people have undertaken, which other people are pursuing as we speak into examining these histories, whether it's of the Ottomans, how did the Ottomans deal with ethnic diversity, something we need to learn before we dismiss them as essentially the sick man of Europe, decrepit, good riddance, because we know the nation state has proved extremely poor fit for ethnic minorities. Whether it's the Qing, how did they deal with the neighbors, what was the tributary system about? I think there's a lot to learn from these examples. And this is one small attempt to refocus attention on these particular debates.
Others? Please, go ahead. And Bruce then.
My name is Baldev Nair. I don't know exactly...
Is the microphone picking this up? I fear it may not be on. Sorry, Baldev.
You need to be close.
First, I must congratulate you on a very powerful and persuasive narrative that you have offered. And I'm not sure where I'm going, with my line of argument, but I like to express it. Firstly, on this question of Western imperialism, I think there is no distinction between the right and the left, because one of the people who made the most forceful argument was Karl Marx, that he said British imperialism, no matter how bad, it was a necessity of history. This, as a country caught in the Asiatic mode of production, British had this historic task to disrupt that system and to bring India into the realm of history. So I don't think there is any difference between the right and the left on this particular issue about a favorable view of imperialism in relation to Asia, because it's not just Rudyard Kipling, but it is a more widespread phenomenon. The same scholar, Karl Marx, also presented a view that the country that is industrialized is the model for the country that is non-industrialized. In other words, he saw very clearly, which is where perhaps I'll go to take a different position, that there is no alternative for a country that is underdeveloped to follow the model of the developed country, because in development is what lies power. And power is not for the exercise of dominion over others, but it starts out with protecting yourself. And every group, from the time of what we know about the Athenian wars, about the Million dialogue, that this is part of human nature for one group to dominate over others. So even if modern development or economic development of today is disruptive of societies, then perhaps countries, given their urban situation and so on, have awful challenges confronting them. But there is no alternative but to follow the Western model, because the alternative to it is domination by the more powerful, whether it is the West or it is China. Thank you.
No, thank you for this very thoughtful intervention. I completely agree with that. And I think the example of Marx is an excellent one, in that he started this whole tradition of essentially people on the left cheerleading this idea that modernization, or more specifically industrialization, is really the only destiny of countries that haven't yet industrialized themselves. And that is the only way to go. It's a particular kind of ideology, it's a particular kind of model where all other possibilities are excluded. And it also shows up how Marx himself, despite all his brilliance, was deeply influenced by the European ideas and ideologies of that period, and how he was invested in this particular idea that had developed post-Renaissance Europe of the individual, the self-seeking individual who pursues his interests. I mean, he brought different variations to that particular notion, but he didn't fundamentally depart from that. So I think also the idea that you had to basically strengthen yourself, strengthen your society, if you don't want to be trampled into the dust by the dominant power. That's a very powerful theme that emerged as I was writing this book, and that's something that all of these Asian thinkers, leaders, intellectuals are wondering about, is that do we really have to turn ourselves into them in order to survive? And in the end, that's what they end up doing. Japan does it. Mao Zedong ends up doing that. And all the other alternatives fall by the wayside. And there are other alternatives being proposed by some of the thinkers I discussed. but those really don't have a chance in this dog-eat-dog world of international relations, is that if you don't do that, you are doomed. You'll be taken over. You'll be destroyed. So that's really the sort of particular tragic arc of history of the last 200 years that, in some sense, part of it that this book also seeks to describe, that there was no, to use a more recent formulation of this dilemma, there is no alternative. Was it Margaret Thatcher who came up with that?
Bruce, please.
Thank you. Bruce Montador, I'm a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. Until a year ago, I was the executive director for Canada and China at the African Development Bank. And I just started your book yesterday, so I haven't got fully through it, but I had, like others, I've read the reviews. I have a couple of questions and a comment. A couple of comments and a question. The comment is, you referred to Japan and Germany and in terms of their efforts at empire. And I guess as you look and wonder whether China and India are following the same route, and certainly there's things going on in Africa, but Japan and Germany seem to have been rather more successful after the Second World War when they weren't pursuing empire. And so it does really raise the question as to whether or not empire for access to raw materials is that central to the economic development. And I think in the first part of the book, I have read the question of where you were going to end up. So I'll find out either when you answer the question or when I finish reading the book about that question about whether everybody's going to turn into proto-European North Americans or whether there's a third way isn't clear. I mean, it's sort of left there hanging. But I think my sense is that Africa needs to worry because Africa's not going to become developed just by exporting raw materials, but whether that means that it's going to be a colony of China and India in the next half century, or whether something else will happen, that seems to me that remains to be seen. I think the economic determinism isn't as strong as the conversation so far makes out. And then a last comment, which is just maybe, it was very interesting to read the reactions that you quote to the Japanese victory over Russia in 1905. But given that I was reading it just after the events of last week, it actually reminded me a little bit about what was going on in the Muslim world in terms of the reaction to the film in the on YouTube. And I don't. It's not the same thing, but it seemed to me it was a bit of a disturbing parallel in that context.
No, it is, and I think it's not sufficiently noted that sort of anti-Westernism has a very fertile soil, particularly in the Arab world, given the events of the last decade. And so nobody really should be shocked or surprised by the periodic eruptions of that sentiment. It just needs a little bit of a spark, and it can happen again, and it'll keep happening, especially because the Arab Spring has released the kind of energies that cannot be tamed by the existing political movements and institutions, that there will be a long period of chaos and anarchy before we can see any semblance of stability in that part of the world. So, of course, there'll be a militia out there wanting to attack the American consulate. It's going to happen again, no question about that. But it's still surprising how people receive that as extremely disturbing news when just in the last decade, hundreds of thousands of Muslims have died in that part of the world in the course of two completely catastrophic wars, and that those societies have witnessed any range of experience, any range of other humiliations from rendition to drone warfare in Yemen, of course in Afghanistan as well. So I think the idea that the United States or the West should still be loved, that expectation, is a deeply irrational expectation. And that sort of creates far too much scope for these feelings of shock and disappointment when something like what happened last week happens. But to go back to your other comment, I mean, I agree. I think there's a danger of becoming too pessimistic and believing too much in a certain kind of deterministic idea or theory. But at the same time, I think one should also, suppose, keep particular events very close to the historical context in which they happened. I think the rise of Germany and Japan in the post-war period was contingent on several factors that were missing previously. Most importantly, the support and the open availability of the American market, because Americans wanted to pacify these two countries, and one of them was under military occupation for a long time. They gave them the kind of concessions, they gave them the kind of assistance that were not forthcoming previously, and that were not forthcoming to a lot of other countries. They were not forthcoming for China, definitely not. So there was, due to certain factors that they became, and they did not need empire at that particular point because they were being given the kind of assistance that they needed at that particular stage. And also there was that moment that not just Germany, but most Western European economies were flourishing after extensive devastation. So I think it's possible that Africa won't become another colony or will become a colony in a different way altogether. But what I don't see how this particular pattern can be altered, where a place like Angola, which suddenly discovers a lot of oil, and then all the oil companies from around the world pour in, and Angola's hotel rooms become the most expensive in the world overnight. Same thing is happening in Mongolia with its 3 million population, an already extreme inequality, already a kind of kleptocratic elite in place. We've seen this happen in the petrodollar states. How we can change this pattern dramatically, and this is, we're talking about Angola, which has the possibility of becoming rich. I'm not even thinking or considering countries which do not have commodities to offer to the rest of the world. What will happen there? What will bring development there? Or would they suffer the fate of semi-modern societies where you have a large population which has been uprooted from rural habitats, sent to the cities to work in factories, to have jobs in the service industry, and you realize there's nothing really going on there in these economies. They have nothing to offer to the world economy. And then you have this floating reservoir of resentment and hatred, indeed, for the political institutions that have expedited their uprooting and the destruction of their traditional lifestyles, which is what you're seeing in India a lot, the kind of rage that is being expressed by a lot of political movements is of people being uprooted from their traditional habitats and being promised something, not being delivered, and that's when they turn militant. So I don't see that pattern being fundamentally altered, which accounts for my slightly pessimistic note.
I think we're going to end with something I've been wanting to ask you about a bit. It seems to me that the shadow of the colonial experience is very long. When I was studying Indian foreign policy, I came to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that one of the strongest inner drivers of Indian foreign policy is the desire for autonomy, never to fall under the undue influence of any power, be it the Soviet Union, be it the US, be it any other. On the other hand, in Nigeria recently, where my parents lived when I was a teenager, I had a very different experience in Abuja and Lagos talking to people. I realized that the link to London was, if anything, stronger for the elite than it had been during the colonial period. People get on the flight to London as we'd get on a bus to Ottawa to transact all meaningful business in London rather than in Nigeria. Yeah. And so I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on this sort of shadow of colonialism into the future.
Indeed. I mean, I think you see these transnational elites everywhere. It's the Nigerians in London. It's the the Malaysian middle classes, upper classes sometimes, shopping in Bandung, of all places, which is become a great design center, name once associated with the first sort of geopolitical assertion of newly independent Asian African countries, become a great shopping center. So you see this sort of these transnational elites everywhere, which have developed new kinds of relationships with the old imperial centers, and have more or less given up on the project of the nation state, which was indeed creating an autonomous space for these nation states to exist. So, Angola, of course, it won't be colonized in the same way, but why need to do that? When you have a local elite willing to help you, they will become, of course, incredibly rich, and they will give you what you want. So why go to the trouble of having a proper administration there, of even making token gestures towards the upkeep of the natives, towards their welfare, when you have these local elites who will keep those people down through hook or by crook, and do their shopping in London, and life would be good, and you don't want any part of that, the messy stuff, as it were. You can have an informal empire in those places. I think India is different, has been different in a sense, because a lot of its early ideals were defined by people like Nehru, who had sort of spent most of their adult lives fighting imperialism and seeing it from up close and diagnosing it often extremely accurately. And he definitely wanted and conceived of an India that was free of those destructive tendencies that he saw in modern imperialisms. And the whole quest for autonomy was part of a larger, I think, moral quest for a new language of politics, of geopolitics as well. And it lingers. I think it lingers in India today. It lingers in civil society institutions. It lingers in the intellectual life of the country. There are any number of influential writers and thinkers who are still influenced by those ideas. But on the whole, there's also been a steady Americanization of the elites in the last 15, 20 years, which is closer to your example of the old sort of colonial legacy. So that has been revived in this other way, which is that the elites have been looking to America for examples of how to construct a successful economy, and they've started looking to America at just the wrong time in history, as is now very apparent. But it's been very difficult to break out of those kinds of obsessions, which developed in the late 90s when the United States was doing very well economically. So now we're all very confused. We don't know where to look next.
Topic for your next book.
Exactly.
Pankaj is happy to sign books just outside the room. To those joining us online, to those in the room in particular, we're very grateful to you for coming. But of course, above all, we're very grateful to Pankaj for making a detour through Ottawa on his trip around North America, for sharing his ideas, his analysis with us, and for leaving us with this truly wonderful book. You said in passing that you're no historian. It isn't true at all, Pankaj. He has an innovation at the conclusion of the book to which I'm sensitive. Rather than the very dry bibliography many of us are used to in academic histories, he has a wonderful bibliographical essay relating books to each other and how they seem to him to be of interest, infinitely more pleasurable than a classic academic bibliography. So you've left us with a great deal of food for thought, and we hope you'll come back again soon. Many thanks.
Thank you, David.